Alrighty, welcome back, boys and girls. Um, Today we're going to talk about the West, cities, and immigration. It's the same time period we talked about last time for the most part during Reconstruction. This is just the stuff that was going on that didn't directly relate to Reconstruction. Before we get into it, I just want to say I really appreciate the traction that the P320 video got. I liked all the interaction there. It was great. It's the most viewed video on the channel right now. And I do plan on doing a lot more firearms content in future. So that was that was very nice to see. And subscribe so you don't miss it. It does help. With that out of the way, let's get after it. Boomtowns. This is a time where people are moving west and they're finding natural resources. And around the abundancies of natural resources is where towns are going to be built because there's lots of jobs to be had there. So, a boomtown is really just any place that experiences rapid economic growth, and it's because they found some sort of natural resource there that they are going to exploit. A lot of times during this time period, it's going to be silver or gold. Later on, we will talk about the same thing happening with oil. If you're familiar with the city of Tombstone, Arizona, Arizona was a boomtown because they found silver there. If you watch the movie Tombstone, in a Pharaoh game, Wyatt Earp wins a couple of mining rights, and they are silver mines. Um, Also, Tombstone, excuse me, is a fantastic movie. It's one of my favorites. As far as historical movies go, it's pretty accurate. I mean, there's definitely some Hollywoodizing in there, and some streamlining. Like there were actually five Earp brothers, and Ike Clanton wasn't a cowboy and stuff like that. But it's a great movie. Go check it out if you haven't seen it. Endlessly quotable. Anyways, mining in general uh, gets really big really fast after something called the Comstock Lode in 1859. Guy named Henry Comstock, he goes to California, Nevada area. He's looking for gold. And all he finds is this bluish clay stuff. It's making mining for gold very difficult. The equipment is not equipped to handle that. So he basically throws up his hands, sells his claim to somebody else because there's no gold here. All there is this crappy clay stuff. Turns out that blue clay was pure silver ore. Um, and this type of thing happens a couple of times in the West, and that's going to lead to a massive explosion of mining and mining as a profession in the West. It becomes so prolific, actually, that there are several territories that owe their statehood to the trade of mining in general. I got them all listed here: Colorado, Arizona, North Dakota, South Dakota, California, Nevada, Montana, all that stuff. So many people flocked there because of mining. And remember, only 11 years before this, 1848, 49, I know who you talk to, was the gold rush out there too. So that was all mining as well. Keep that in mind. And because there's so many people out here and they have to transport so much equipment and then ideally, whatever they dig up out of the ground to and fro, this is also yields a massive demand for railroads, which creates more jobs, another trade, more money. Economy's doing fairly good in this specific area during Reconstruction. The South, remember, is pretty torn up, but this area, there's a lot of jobs, things are expanding, that kind of stuff. Ranching is another profession that explodes during this time as people are moving west. If you remember, during the Trail of Tears, a lot of Indians were relocated to the Great Plains because it was seen as a useless piece of land because you couldn't farm on it. It wasn't good. It wasn't good soil. It was sandy, and it would have been hard to do the traditional kind of farming that people were used to on the East Coast. However, the Mexicans have been doing this other kind of farming for a long time called ranching. And with the annexation of Texas a couple decades prior, a lot of Mexican traditions are moving their way into the United States. And new breed of cattle not gets discovered, but becomes very popular, called the Texas Longhorn. And the Longhorns are specifically bred to survive in the conditions that are the Great Plains. Very little water and shitty grass, basically. Um, and they do great. And ranching explodes because of the Longhorns. And cattle driving along with ranching becomes very widespread. All the way from Abilene, Texas, if you're not familiar, it's central West Texas, all the way to Dodge City, Kansas. I mean, back and forth regularly. That was a pretty big highway for cattle drives. And this is where the term cowboy comes from. It wasn't a term of endearment the way that it is now. It was a way to describe a low level tradesman, basically. Traveling, often nomadic workers. Excuse me today, my throat's a little dry. Traveling, nomadic workers, unskilled labor. Being a cowboy during this time period was not seen as this like romantic thing the way that it is today. It meant you were bottom of the barrel, low skilled labor, and you could ride a horse, and that's all we need you to do. um, with the railroads expanding um, and Western cattle becoming more available to East Coast buyers, it means that regardless of where your ranch is, now that cattle driving is a thing and eventually railroads spanning the country, Western cattle becomes very available and profitable on the East Coast. So ranching is going to explode for beef to be sold on the East Coast for massive profits. Where did all this knowledge come from? I alluded to this a minute ago, but Mexico. As a Texan myself, it hurts a little bit to say this, but the truth is the truth. Basically, everything that anybody thinks of when you think of the American cowboy came from Mexico. The boots, the hat, the knowledge, the cattle themselves, all of it came from Mexico. They had been doing this for generations before Americans started doing it, and they borrowed that knowledge. A lot of the words that we associate with the profession have Spanish origins. Lariat, lasso, stampede, all that stuff. It comes from the Romantic languages, specifically Spanish. Um, Vaquero is a common term that just means cowboy in Spanish. A lot of Western themed things get named Vaquero because it has this connotation, and vice versa. So that's where it comes from. Barbed wire. Barbed wire is going to be huge for two reasons. Number one, it's going to split up the West. It's going to disrupt a lot of long cattle drives that we talked about. It's also going to be the reason that jeans are invented. We'll get there in a second. So, 1865, the idea of really, really long cattle drives kind of comes to an end. It doesn't end overall, but not nearly on the same like highway level that it was before. Land is being split up. People are buying the land as westward expansion grows, becomes more popular. A lot of the land was unclaimed before, so it didn't matter if you drove your cattle through X area because literally nobody owned it aside from the government. Um, and when people started buying up plots of land, they needed a cheap, easy, and effective way to enclose their land, to stop trespassers, to keep their own cattle in, their other people's cattle out, all of the things that you need fences for. Barbed wire becomes the easy, cheap way to do it. And this disrupts a lot of traditional cattle drive routes. And at first, it's met with a lot of apprehension. People don't like it. The long cattle drives are sort of tradition at this point in time, but people come around to it. With the expansion of railroads, the need for these really long drives kind of goes away, and the idea of being able to not only shut people who you don't want out of your land, but to keep your livestock in a place that was close and monitorable, and being able to keep your livestock close to food and water beat out the disadvantages of not being able to do long drives anymore. And like I said, especially with the advent of railroads, it kind of didn't matter anymore. So barbed wire changes the ranching game eventually for the better. And this is also where denim comes from. So barbed wire comes about and it's great and does all the things we just talked about. But it's terrible on your clothes. If you've ever put up a fence, you've got ripped clothes. So the need for a very durable garment that was also breathable and do all the things that a rancher needs. That need arises, especially with barbed wire. And I forget exactly who came up with it, but it comes out during this time period. And it's made from cotton, which is great because we know that the South isn't doing great, but we know the one thing they're really good at is making cotton. So denim comes about, jeans become very popular, even 150 years later, more than that today. Denim is massive. But it comes about right here, helps a little bit save the economy in the South, and helps people in the West. So good deals all around. There is a period of real outlaws, like actual, like what today we think of as cowboys, not what we just said were cowboys, but the stereotypical cowboy, uh, Josie Wales, Clint Eastwood cowboy. And you have that in the roughly 20 and change years after the Civil War. So we have this explosion of money and property in the West, cattle, ranches, mines. And remember, these territories are not yet states. There is no real government out there. There is certainly no real police force out there. With this explosion of money and lack of government, it creates an environment that is ripe to be taken advantage of by people who take advantage of things. And this is the time period where we see the classic cowboy outlaw. And as all things need to be equal, um, we also see the rise of famous lawmen. Wyatt Earp, we already talked about, Wild Bill Hickok, Pat Garrett, things like that. Um, so there is a little bit of a myth of like the cowboy ethos, the outlaw ethos, and how long it lasted. But there is a genuine period where this stuff did happen. People were robbing trains and banks, and there were gangs, and all of that did happen. It just wasn't as prolific as Hollywood, and maybe in our hearts we kind of wish it was. But nevertheless, it was there. The Indian Wars. This is basically what the U.S. military was doing after the Civil War, and especially after the failure of Reconstruction and the kind of standing army is removed from the South. This is what the bluecoats, the Unions, the U.S. military is doing. So, like we've talked about this whole time, way more Americans are settling in the West, and the more Americans that are settling in the West, the more interactions with Native Americans there are. And the more interactions there are, the more negative interactions there are. And it was the duty of the military at this time to suppress Indians and negative conflicts with them. All of that culminates in a series of 30-ish, maybe more years where both sides are just committing terrible, terrible atrocities, massacres, women, children, murdering, desecrating of dead bodies, uh, and on both sides. Like nobody is innocent here. Yeah, the morality of all of this is to be debated at a separate time. Um, but for example, at Wounded Knee, 200 men were killed, in addition to scores of women and children. It wouldn't be until the late 1890s that a lot of this comes to an end. And even then, the early 1900s aren't free of it either. It's just a lot of stuff take the front seat. There's a lot of stuff happening in the early 1900s. There's a lot of good books about this period and the period right before the Civil War, where kind of a lot of the same stuff is happening. If you are interested in a fictional but nevertheless historically close representation of what was going on in the decades before and after the Civil War that has to do with the Native Americans and stuff going on like at the border. The book Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy is fantastic. Um, However, I will warn you, it is not for the faint of heart. It is exceptionally graphic, um, but it is the events that happen in that book are plausible historical events. It is not a biography. It is not like a historical retelling. However, the events in it are plausible. Excuse me. The book follows the Glanton Gang, which was a real group of people across their travels right after the Mexican American War. And Cormac McCarthy took like 27 years or some crazy amount of time to write this book because he was plotting out the actual route that the Glanton Gang took, and then he used that route to create a fictional story that went along with it. And it really very much captures the tone of the time period. Great book. Cannot recommend it. Carl McCarthy in general is just really good. Anyways, the Battle of Little Bighorn was one of the final Indian Wars. This is very often known as Custer's Last Stand. And I want to put it in here because it's famous. And also, recently, I did a little bit of a deep dive into Custer and, quite honestly, his arrogance with his 7th Cavalry. And I just wanted to talk about it. So, long story short, broad overview. There are a bunch of American prospectors mining on a Sioux reservation. And by doing this, they're breaking a treaty between the U.S. government and the Sioux. This treaty said that there wouldn't be any Americans in this area, and there are. So, in response to the American side breaking their treaty, the Sioux breaks the treaty by leaving their reservation to go hunt. There's more plentiful hunting in X area, so they're going to go over there and do it. And the U.S. is mad because we're allowed to break our treaties, but you're not. So they send in the military. The unit they send in is the 7th Cavalry, and who is in charge of it? None other than Colonel George Custer. And they try to take on this native force by themselves. And they don't call it his last stand because he won. It doesn't go well for him, and he made a whole pile of mistakes from beginning to end. If he had like chosen one of those mistakes not to make, he probably could have saved his men and arguably won the battle. He is overconfident. If in his writings he says all of the time how much he believed in his Seventh Cavalry could take on any foe, and I respect that. I respect the amount of confidence. The Seventh Cavalry was not to be trifled with. They were an exceptional unit in the U.S. military. However, he was a bit overconfident, and he makes a couple of mistakes on this entire venture. First and foremost, he attacks in broad daylight, and doesn't even have the sun to his advantage. And while he was sent out, or at the time he was sent out by the higher ups, he was supposed to take with him several. I think it was three. But it was at least two Gatling guns. If you don't know what a Gatling gun is, it was an early form of machine gun. Kind of. It was a repeating firearm, multiple barrels. It looked like a modern day minigun, and shot very fast. And keep in mind, this is the era of still, revolvers at best, for multi-shot firearms, and the, infantry rifle is still a single shot. Nothing about this is fast. They have not adopted lever guns, nothing like that. However, the natives did have lever guns. Anyways, um, in addition to refusing the Gatling guns, he also refused the addition of four other companies from the Second Cavalry, because, of course, his Seventh Cavalry can do anything. They can handle any foe. Um, Turns out, not the case. And then, as if all of that weren't bad enough, he goes ahead and divides his Seventh Cavalry into a bunch of smaller detachments, and they're pretty far away from each other. So it means they can't support each other. And on top of that, his own scouts, along with some friendly native scouts, before the battle started, came back to Custer and said, there are way more Native Americans here than we thought. This force is much too large. We cannot take them on. And you know exactly what he said. The 7th Cavalry can take on any foe. And then they all died. That is the story of Custer's Last Stand. It often gets very romanticized, and it was this big push for, the West, push towards the West and by Anglos, and we're gonna push out these savages, and he dies trying. He made every mistake possible and got all of his men killed. I have very little remorse for Colonel Custer. His arrogance got him and his men killed, and that's very unfortunate for his men, however. He may have got what was coming to him. Anyways, I didn't say that. The Dawes Act is a big piece of legislation that comes around. In each episode, we have to do a little bit of boring politics. So let's get into it. With all of this violence between the natives and the Americans, the there was this idea that the solution was assimilation. A non-trivial amount of Americans thought that if they could get the natives to assimilate into American culture, um, then everybody would be one culture, and then there wouldn't be, this ferocity towards each other. The Dawes Act comes along and divides up these reservations into individual allotments for each family. And this, in theory, is a good thing. It's providing each native family with their own private property. You're not stuck on a reservation. A lot of the reservation rules, in theory, would go away with the Dawes Act. Unfortunately, the idea of like European style, East Coast style farming is not what the Native Americans did. You know, and I think this gets lost a lot and misinterpreted and misunderstood because when Europeans first got to North America, it was the natives who taught them how to farm, um, but not in the way that a lot of people think. The idea of growing corn and things of that nature absolutely saved the early colonists, but natives didn't do traditional European style farming. A lot of it was nomadic. A lot of it was, hunting and following buffalo herds. And there was absolutely planting of crops, but it was seasonal and nomadic, if that makes sense. Like there were absolutely planting of crops, in X area, and then in the fall, call it. And then for the next 9 months, this group of natives would go and follow a herd of buffalo for, the winter and the rough months and the summer. And then they would come back to the area where they planted that corn in late summer and fall and harvest it and then do it kind of all over again, if that makes sense. So it wasn't the traditional kind of like what we think of as like homesteading now. And what the Dawes Act did was set the Native Americans up to be good, to have land for homesteading. And Native Americans didn't know how to homestead in the manner that the government was trying to set them up to do. Basically, a massive miscommunication. And without that knowledge and without knowing that they needed that knowledge, the Dawes Act becomes an absolute failure and everybody loses and everybody is upset. Shocker, that's kind of, you know, par for the course at this point in history. Um, at the same time, again, being living in Texas, I do want to throw this in there because it's important for the way that we view this part of the country today. As we know, Texas was famously part of the Confederacy and very much associated with the South. However, Texas rebrands during this time period. They come to the realization, and the correct realization, frankly, that their previous association with the Confederacy is not great. It's bad for business. People, if they're not carpetbaggers, but are looking for a new place to go, they don't want to go to a place that was affiliated with the Confederacy. You know what I mean? So they spend a lot of time and effort to rebrand their state from a southern one to a western one. And this western connotation is kind of still what we have today. And this new connotation, this new western connotation, makes Texas more appealing to Americans wanting to move west and also immigrants coming from Europe. There's a massive amount of immigrant. Well, we're going to talk about this in a second, but there's a massive amount of immigrants coming from Europe during this time period because there's a lot of conflicts going on in Europe at this time, and a lot of people don't want to be there for it, and they're seeing the expansion of the U.S. and Western lands are fairly cheap. Southern lands are definitely very cheap, um, and there's a huge influx of European immigrants at this time. And this allows Texas to capture a lot of them, a lot of German immigrants are going to move to Texas, Fredericksburg, Bernie area, actually. Um, and let's just get into that right now. So between the end of the Civil War and 1914, which is 50-ish years, 49, 25 million Europeans immigrate to the U.S. for a whole boatload of reasons. Like I said, there's Europe is in turmoil. There's a lot of stuff going on. Um, there's a lot of consolidation of some states and fighting in other states. Uh, Germany is becoming a country. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on. So to escape poverty, is a huge one. That's kind of the staple reason that people immigrate to the U.S. For opportunity, basically. To avoid forced military service was a big one. In a lot of these conflicts, there was conscription, forced conscription. People didn't want to do that. High food prices was a big one. After the potato famine, and with a lot of this war, food prices in Europe, frankly, were very high because food was not as plentiful as it was maybe a generation prior. Overpopulation is a huge one, and religious persecution becomes more and more of an issue, and why Europeans are moving in. Anti-Semitism is growing at this time period. Um, and Jews from all over the place, Poland and Prussia and the Balkan, all over the place, are moving to the U.S. And they at this time, Ellis Island is set up. Last time we talked about immigration, Ellis Island wasn't really the hub of immigration that it was going to be. Now it is. So all of these European immigrants are going to be processed through Ellis Island in New York, and then they will go ahead and distribute throughout the country. On the other side, there's also a massive amount of Asian immigration at this time, from Japan, but mostly from China. And for a lot of the same reasons that Europeans are moving here. For opportunity, to avoid war, to avoid poverty, to come for the opportunity of employment, bunch of stuff like that. And a lot of Chinese immigrants are going to find uh, work on the Transcontinental Railroad, on the uh, Union Pacific side. I think I got that right. The side moving from California east and not moving west. And those who didn't find work on the railroad, a lot of other Asian immigrants came over with a lot of skilled labor, and a lot of ones who didn't become skilled laborers became very successful merchants. Um, the ability to trade with that part of the world is a fairly novel thing. We'll talk about the opening of Japan to this part of the world in a couple of episodes. But just open to China at this time was a really, really big deal. And as opposed to Ellis Island on the East Coast, the processing center for immigrants on the West Coast is Angel Island in California. And then they would go ahead and disperse from there. That's what's going on with immigration. American immigration, people are I put this in there just because it fits with the other ones. They're not really immigrating, but they're spreading out. People are moving across the country like crazy, to and fro cities. Some people are moving west to get away from the cities. There's a lot of people on the East Coast moving into the cities. Let's talk about it. So, in the 30 years between 1870 and 1900, 20 million Americans move into cities, from rural areas into cities. Immigrants that moved into the city often were lacking funds. It's a classic stereotypical story, but it does have its root in truth. Um, a lot of these people coming in didn't have the money to go and buy farms or the education to get high paying jobs. So they put their unskilled labor to work in American factories, and American factories are in the city. And rural Americans are moving to cities because as cities become more and more industrialized, there are more amenities in cities. The idea of having electricity and running water and indoor plumbing is very enticing for some people. And there's also a lot of high paying jobs in the cities. As, again, more industry finds itself there, there are more and more prospering companies and corporations. Those corporations need people to help run it. Those are going to be high paying jobs. So people are looking towards the city for opportunity just as much as people are looking toward the West for opportunity. There's a lot going on, especially as more people get closer to each other in the cities. A lot of immigration leads to feelings of nativism. This is kind of what nativism is often what today most people actually associate with nationalism. And they are two separate things, and it is important to realize that nationalism isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can actually be a very good thing. Nativism uh, is a lot of times, almost always, a negative thing. Nativism is the blanket distaste of immigrants um, from local born people. I'm looking at this now and realizing that's worded funny and doesn't really make sense. Nativism is the distaste of immigrants by local born people. And a lot of this is focused on Asians on the West Coast and Jews on the East Coast. And this can be very clearly seen in the Chinese Exclusion Act. It basically tries to bar Chinese or Asian people in general, but targeting Chinese people um, from becoming part of like the U.S. culture, from assimilating. Like we just talked about how we want the Native Americans to assimilate. That idea does not extend to the Chinese at this time period. It restricts their immigration as a whole, and it is solely based on their race. It's going to be mostly targeting unskilled Chinese labor, and it's going to stop them from becoming U.S. citizens. This law prohibits Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens. Even if they wanted to assimilate, they legally could not. And this is going to signal, at the time, hard to see, but now hindsight being 2020, it's 100 years later, we can see that this is the beginning of a shift in U.S. immigration policy from very open and welcoming of everyone to fairly restrictive, leading up to the early 1900s, where we become very isolationist. We want to keep out of World War One. It's a European war. We don't want to touch it. We become very enclosed. We don't want to deal with the outside world. The outside world has a bunch of problems. We have our own problems to solve. Too bad, so sad. And this is kind of the beginning of that. Um, that said, looking forward, 60-ish years, um, the Chinese Exclusion Act gets repealed in 1943 during World War II due to improved relations with China. China is a massive ally during World War II. If you know your Asian history and I guess World War II history, it doesn't really get talked about in U.S. history, but how much China was involved in Japanese expansion and things like that. Basically, the common enemy of the Japanese allowed the U.S. and China's relations to improve, and the U.S. would, support the nationalist side of their civil war until they fell to communism in 1949. Just to look forward, just so you know, a little bit off track, but I thought it was important to talk about. Um, The other prejudice that comes up during this time period, we talked about this a couple of episodes ago, the prejudice from Protestants towards Catholic people. We talked about the rift that was there for a long time, and now Catholics have a decided minority among Americans. Protestantism is much more popular among the Anglos who are coming in and the Americans who have been here. There is a massive prejudice towards Catholics and will be for a long time. One of the groups that the KKK targets is Catholics. Um, and the stigma really kind of won't go away from Catholics until JFK gets elected in 1960. JFK is the first Catholic president of the United States, and he almost didn't win because he was Catholic, but story for another time. Just know there's a lot of prejudice going on, and it's focused on a very few select groups of people, which it normally is. Life in a big city. Those amenities sound really good, but lead to a lot of not great things that we still see today. Life in the city is crowded. Land is scarce. We can't build out, so we have to build up. This gives us skyscrapers and subways and like the T in Boston, elevated railroad like Chicago, stuff like that. Um, with the unskilled laborers working in factories with really bad conditions and really long hours. Upton Sinclair has a great book about that. Um, with all of that, it makes people desperate. And with desperate people, you get increased crime rates. With a lot of people close together, you get increased disease rates. And remember, there's like no environmental policing at this time. We don't even know that really that's a thing yet. So, all of these major industrial centers in these really big cities, there's a lot of pollution for a lot of different things. You know, there's industrial runoff, but there's also like improper disposal of sewage, as gross as that sounds. Like the idea of sewers is very new. Indoor plumbing is very new. There are quirks in the system that have to be worked out, and they're getting worked out in big cities, and it is really gross for kind of a really long time. Life in a big city isn't great, regardless of the opportunities that it does provide. Machine politics. Very quickly, oh, I just realized I reused that picture. Don't mind that. You didn't see that. You can't prove that. Um, Machine politics and corruption. This is going to be a period ripe for corruption. We kind of alluded to this a little bit last episode with Ulysses S. Grant and his cabinet being fairly corrupt. Remember, he wasn't, but his cabinet was full of kind of dirtbags. The political machine is this informal group. Nobody like set up the political machine. But what you have here is kind of the beginnings of organized crime. And organized crime being meshed with politics. So if you are a person who is living in the city and are facing all of the negative aspects of living in the city, you need a job, you need a house, you have no food, you have no heat. You know, all these criminals are attacking you. You need police protection. Well, tell you what, if you vote for me, I can give you a job, or I can make sure you get in housing, or I can make sure the police come around this corner and protect you more. It's organized crime mixed with politics. This is arguably the first time we see it in mass in the United States, and it starts during this time period. So keep that in mind as we move forward. We're going to talk about city expansion a lot coming up, and keep in mind that this started basically as soon as there were major metropolitan centers. Corruption was almost immediate. And I think we're going to end it here today. Yeah, I want to end with machine politics, corruption, the way that cities have turned out, not the way that a lot of people were expecting. Definitely not the way that a lot of European immigrants were expecting. It's going to lead to a lot of hardships on their part. That being said, we'll wrap it up there. I appreciate you guys coming out. I have to do the thing. Uh, I never thought I was going to do this, but please do like, subscribe. It does help. The channel is growing. I'm really happy to see that. The more it grows, the more content I can put out, the more time I can dedicate to it. So please do like, share, subscribe, all the things. Um, Other than that, I appreciate you coming out, and I'll catch you in the next one.